Singet, 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 singet dem Herren ein neues Lied. Singet, 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 singet dem Herren alle Welt, singet dem Herren alle Welt, singet dem Herren alle Welt, singet dem Herren alle Welt,
Hello, my name is Shaylee O'Leary, and I am a sophomore music education major with the piano primary at Susquehanna University. The piece you were just listening to is Singet dem Herren ein neues Lied, written by Heinrich Schütz. This piece can be found in the second volume of his larger collection titled Symphonia Sacra. Heinrich Schütz was known as the greatest German composer of the 17th century, and he was also the first internationally recognized German composer. He was born on October 9, 1585, and during his childhood he was provided with a thorough, well-rounded education consisting of religious and liberal arts. Along with this, he also demonstrated an exceptional ability to sing securely and gracefully from a very young age, as well as a proficiency regarding learning music in a quick and efficient manner. When he was 24 years old, he left the University of Marburg, where he was studying law, and moved to Venice, Italy, to study under remarkable composer Giovanni Gabrieli. While studying with Gabrieli, Schütz learned about the Venetian polychoral style, which consisted of multiple alternating choirs presented in different locations of the church to create a sound of dialogue within a piece. This polychoral style is extremely important to be aware of because this utilization of alternating voices inspired Schütz's composition of Symphonia Sacra. It is also important to note that the 3 volumes of Symphonia Sacra, which were composed and published by Schütz, were also based on Gabrieli's own volumes of Symphonia Sacra, which were published far before those of Schütz, as his first volume was published in 1597 and his second volume was published in 1615, whereas the 3 volumes composed by Schütz were published in 1629, 1647, and 1650, respectively. Furthermore, Gabrieli published his Symphonia Sacra before the 30 Years' War, which was a series of conflicts that emerged from the tension between the Protestant and Catholic states of the Holy Roman Empire. This war lasted from 1618 to 1648, and it took place in Central Europe, primarily in Germany. Given the fact that Schütz returned to Germany in 1613 after the death of Gabrieli and remained there until his death in 1672, this war affected him directly, for like any war, the 30 Years' War led to a drastic disruption to the male population, for the great majority of men were either fighting in the war or unfortunately dying in the war. Due to this unforeseen disruption, Schütz was left with no choice but to write the pieces of his Symphonia Sacra for a single voice rather than for multiple large choirs. This voice is also indicated as a high tenor or a soprano, meaning that it was intended to be sung by either a young man or a woman, for their population was much less affected by the war. This is a direct contrast from the Symphonia Sacra, which was written by Gabrieli, for Gabrieli was able to write compositions for multiple choirs rather than for just a single voice part, given that his works were published before the war, and therefore his compositions were not impacted by the steep population decline which resulted from the 30 Years' War. We can see more evidence of the effect of the 30 Years' War if we look at the 3rd volume of Schütz's Symphonia Sacra, which was written in 1650, 2 years after the end of the 30 Years' War in 1648. In this volume, we see the return of the polychoral style as the men return from the war and the population begins to restore itself, and therefore more voices can be utilized within musical compositions. Nonetheless, Singet dem Herren ein neues Lied belongs to the 2nd volume of Symphonia Sacra, which was published in 1647 before the war had ended, and it is therefore still impacted by the disruption to the male population, hence why it is written for a single voice, along with organ and 2 violins. The title of Singet dem Herren ein neues Lied translates to Sing unto the Lord a new song, and it is based on the text of Psalm 98 from the 150 Psalms of David. Schütz actually wrote another composition based on the text of Psalm 98, which was published in his collection Psalm and Davids in 1619. By looking at this piece, we can see that Schütz was able to compose this collection for 2 choirs, given that it was likely written before the drastic impacts of the war, whereas Singet dem Herren ein neues Lied could unfortunately not be written utilizing the Venetian polychoral style. I believe it is also important to observe just how drawn Schütz was to the text of Psalm 98, for the themes of praising our Lord and rejoicing in song, as well as the beauty of creation, provide excellent word-painting opportunities for so many composers, including Heinrich Schütz. The original printed version of Singet dem Herren ein neues Lied can be found as a physical copy held in the State Library of Berlin, or as a digital copy on the International Music Score Library Project, more commonly referred to as IMSLP. By looking at this original version, we can see that it is indicated that this piece should be sung by a cantus, or soprano, or by a high tenor. By looking in the top left-hand corner, we can see that the piece is written utilizing a C clef, there is a B flat in the key signature, and there is also a mensural notation sign indicating a 3-to-1 ratio, which calls for imperfect time, perfect prolation, which is felt as our modern 6/8 time. However, in certain instances of the piece, the mensural notation sign changes to one shaped as an incomplete circle, which indicates imperfect time, imperfect prolation, which is felt as our modern 4/4 time. This alternation occurs in several places within the 3 pages of the piece, such as on the 6th line of the first page, the 1st line of the 2nd page, and the 3rd line of the 2nd page. It is also important to note that although Schütz appears to be very intentional with his alternations of the meter, there are no bar lines within the piece, which could cause potential issues when later versions are made, such as disruptions to this intended meter or interruptions to the text of the piece itself. One of the most famous later editions of Singet dem Herren ein neues Lied is the version by Philipp Spitta, which was published in 1888. One of the major distinctions between this edition and the original printed version is that this edition is written in full score notation, where the parts for the organ, the cantus or tenor voice, and the 2 violins are all presented on each page, whereas the original version is written in part book format, meaning that each part has its own designated book, hence why in Schütz's version we saw the voice part isolated onto its own page. Additionally, in this version we can see the addition of bar lines. These bar lines do occur in the middle of a word sometimes, such as during the melisma on the all syllable of alle at the beginning of the 3rd line, but overall they do not appear to present any disruptions to the phrases within the text. Furthermore, they reinstate the meter of the piece, which much like the original alternates between that 6/8 feel of imperfect time, perfect prolation, and the 4/4 feel of imperfect time, imperfect prolation. We can also see a remarkable similarity between the organ parts for the 2 versions, for other than the addition of bar lines to the organ part in the Spitta version, these parts are the same in every other aspect, such as the fact that they both contain the same pitches as well as the same note durations, and both of these can be seen by looking at the original organ part written by Schütz. Additionally, both versions are written using the practice of figured bass, which is represented by the accidentals and the numbers indicating intervals, which can be found over top of certain notes within the organ parts. Finally, there are many modern versions of the piece, such as this one arranged by Paul Horn. Although we do not have complete access to this version, it is important to know that it is, in fact, accessible in the public domain. By looking at this modern edition, we can see several changes made, such as a tempo marking indicating presto, whereas the other versions we have looked at thus far have no tempo indications. Additionally, unlike the organ parts for the other versions of this piece, which contain simply the bass line with the figured bass written over top, the entirety of the organ part is written out for this modern edition, presenting each note of each chord. In Schütz's time, organ players would use the figured bass to create a 4-voice polyphony, sounding each voice for the chord at a different time, thus giving independence to each line, which in turn creates a part which flows and contributes to what they are accompanying. However, a problem which stems from the writing out of this organ part is that sometimes if the composer goes too far when it comes to this realization of the organ part, it can rid the piece of all opportunity for the 4-voice polyphony which is intended to occur within each chord. Fortunately, this modern edition does not appear to run into this issue, for we can see that there are quite a few instances where the voices of the chords move on their own, as indicated by the figured bass, thus making sure that the piece can still contain that 4-voice polyphony which Schütz intended to have within the piece. Overall, Singet dem Herren ein neues Lied is a rather insightful piece indicating the shift in compositional aspects over different time periods as changes such as adding bar lines and writing out accompaniments appear as time goes on. Even further, this piece also provides us with insight on the social impacts associated with this piece, for not only can we observe how the composition of this piece had to be altered in order to accommodate the disruption to the population caused by the 30 Years' War, but the text from Psalm 98 from the Psalms of David are words as old as time, which not only continue to resonate with Heinrich Schütz in the 17th century, but they also resonate with us today. Thank you for watching my video on Singet dem Herren ein neues Lied by Heinrich Schütz.